Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Gwen Cadu, the Director of Enterprise IT and Managed Services at GDIT. Gwen, good to have you with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And this whole issue, enterprise modernization, this is such a big topic, and there's so much money coming at it now as a result of recent legislation that was signed into law by President Biden just a few weeks ago. So Gwen, give us the big picture on modernization. How do agencies think about it in this day and age, and what are some of the big challenges you see them facing?
Sure. So one of I think the biggest issues are the budgets. Not only the budgets, the size of the budgets, but the budget cycles and being able to fit the amount of modernization that takes place or needs to take place with some of our enterprises and fitting that within those budgets and within those cycles. There's also the challenges with all the legacy equipment that we have, things that can't be modernized but still need to be maintained. They're sort of the annoying piece of equipment that you can't get rid of because we're so reliant on whatever mission that legacy piece of equipment is supporting. So you can't get rid of it, but you can't modernize it either. So what do? How do you get those things to a more modern infrastructure is very, very difficult. On sort of more of a contractual side, we've sort of developed these technical silos because of the cycles that our acquisitions go through. We love to take contracts and split them up into lots of little pieces to kind of share the wealth, I think is the expected objective of that. But what that does is you've created now independent entities that are all working to create a common goal with an integrated enterprise, but they're all doing it independently. So that creates a lot of other challenges with the number of tools that are being procured and being collected essentially by our customers, because there's not the integration of the functionality of the tools that are being bought across all of the different contracts. So now, I mean, there's a customer that I worked for that had 7 different network management tools to all manage different parts of the network, but they were all different tools. And they're paying, licensing costs for those. They're paying, maintenance costs for all of that. And it can get quite expensive, which then goes back to the problems with budgets. You can't keep maintaining that level of collecting tools. It's just not going to.
Sure. So the implication is that often agencies take a software-centric or a technology-centric approach when they begin modernization. And you have postulated the idea that you can almost make technology an afterthought if you do the right planning for the goal that you have as your end state, and then kind of back the technology into doing that. Tell us more about that concept.
Sure, and yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of names for that. There's, outside in, there's mission first. It basically does start with the need or what the problem is that your customer's trying to address. Start there, don't start with the solution. That oftentimes we get that, I call it the shiny object syndrome, where something new, hits, the market, from our vendors, and you're like, okay, that's great, but what problem are you trying to solve with that? Do you really need that right now? 5G right now is a big technology that everybody's looking at. There's a lot of promise with 5G that everybody's looking at, but do you need to go to 5G today? Is that something that you have to do? Can it be done with the LTE capabilities that we already have? There's a lot of considerations that need to be made. You don't just pick a shiny object and try to put a square peg sort of into a round hole.
So as an integrator, then GDIT can maybe abstract some of those technology questions, at the same time simplify it in terms of what the agency is going to have to buy and manage, and yet still get that digital idea done that they had originally.
Absolutely. As a systems integrator and as a managed service provider, GDIT, it's our responsibility to do that, and it's embedded in our processes, and it's really also embedded in our culture. of always being on the lookout of new technologies. We have a great alliance program with some of our vendors, some of our, what we believe are the best in breed vendors, to kind of support that. And we are continuously updating that. And there's actually sort of three phases to that, where, there's the ones that we know and use, quite often. Then there's sort of a middle group of emerging technologies. And then there's the bleeding edge technologies. So we're always looking at what's coming out and where it is in the sort of in the life cycle of that technology. Is it too bleeding edge? And a lot of that also depends on your customer's risk profile. How comfortable are they with bringing in something brand new when they're not really sure that you've really kicked the tires on it yet completely.
And you mentioned different stages of technology, some of the legacy products, some cutting edge products, which gets to the question of life cycle considerations, because you do, as you mentioned, have to maintain these things sometimes longer than you would like to.
Yeah.
So how do life cycle planning and the whole balancing of maintenance and upgrades versus putting in what's new and shiny, how do agencies, what's the best approach to that aspect of managing all this technology, that it's not all put in at the same time and has the same life cycle to it?
So obviously, what in a perfect world, if we could, you would love to just shut down the enterprise, fix it, modernize it, do all the things you want to do, but you can't do that because there's still a mission that needs to be done. So you have to develop a plan, and it has to be very strategic, and it has to be progressive, and it has to align with a lot of different schedules, cycles. There's refresh cycles, there's mission cycles where there's mission activities that are going on that you can't do things. There's contract cycles where you have to, there are certain things that have to be done contractually within a certain period of time. So having to pull all of that together in a roadmap, it's got to be like I said, a progressively an increasing in function, or progressive increase in function that is always tied to the customer's mission. You can't just start doing this stuff without that. Again, the outcomes are the things that you're focused on.
Plus, agencies also run into the problem sometimes from a technical standpoint that if they do too much too fast, they find that certain compatibilities might break that they need to keep going in the background. For example, database calls to other applications. It gets pretty detailed, but you only know it when it doesn't happen and suddenly things aren't working. So that would be part of the considerations too, I would think.
Absolutely. And it's an excellent point in that these enterprises aren't sort of the enterprises of old where things were sort of segmented into, you had your network group. I mean, you do still have these functions, the network group, the server groups, the storage groups, but the dependencies on the capabilities that we're delivering are so much larger, so that if you start tweaking or updating, a piece of the enterprise, and you have not considered all of the dependencies that function may be supporting, you're absolutely right. Things are going to break. Things are not going to go well if you haven't looked at all of those dependencies. The enterprise is really, I like to kind of think of it more as this sort of ecosystem where all of these technologies work together to deliver these services that we're bringing to the customer that they need to support their missions. It's almost a living, breathing thing at this point, because it's just gotten so big and so complicated. It's a very, very good point, because everything is dependent on everything else. And when one part of it goes down, the whole thing goes down, or the potential, not always, the potential for things to go down will go down.
And the sensitivity to that might not come from individual technology point vendors. And that perhaps is where GDIT, say, as an integrator, can think in that strategic level and to help an agency map out what those dependencies might be, such that the breakages don't happen, and yet you still get that modernization idea forwarded.
Absolutely. And there, we actually have tools that help us identify those dependencies and keep track of those dependencies as the baseline continues to change. Because the baseline is always changing. There's always things going on. There's patching going on. There's software updates that are going on. It is always changing. But it's those big muscle movements when you're trying to get things from, one technology to the next technology that's replacing that. So things like on the network side, software defined networks, big, how do you do that? And what's the plan for doing that? You don't just go in and start, ripping out routers and start putting in, software defined network routers. You have to plan that out, and you have to understand what the implications are across your enterprise.
And you mentioned 5G also. That's another one that could have the potential to affect a lot of things down the chain from the 5G itself too, isn't it?
Absolutely. The potential of 5G is just, there really is no limit to it. And we haven't even begun to scratch the surface with the potential use cases. And I think the big thing with that is just this Internet of Things and the amount of data are coming into these enterprises and how we're going to manage that. And one of the things that we're doing here at GDIT is we have actually started several 5G development and test labs so that we can start kind of kicking the tires on this stuff. The thought about 5G is, there's sort of, the way I look at it, there's kind of two pieces. There's the wireless side, the actual transmission side. And then once it becomes a 1 or a 0, it should be just like any other 1 or 0 that we have on our network. But is it really? How do we start managing that? How do you monitor that? What are the metrics that we're looking for that are different maybe than what we're looking at with just, your standard email application? With the Internet of Things, how are you going to keep track of all of that stuff? I think that there's a lot to be learned there. 5G is really still evolving. The standards are still being developed and modified. And as everybody's sort of learning about this, it's changing. So you kind of have to adapt to that as well. But as far as 5G, just we haven't even, it's going to be kind of an exciting thing to kind of look forward to. We've been talking about, like 4G enabled things that we never would have heard of, like Uber and Airbnb, right? So what's the next best thing? What can we do now with this new technology? And that's part of what we, again, as a system integrator, need to look at is what are the best ways to integrate that technology to really help support the missions of our customers. And there's a lot of folks that are leading the way on that, in the DoD. I mean, they have put so much thought into sort of the potential of 5G and what they're looking for. And so we're working with them and looking at some of the prototypes that they're actually looking at. And it's everything from, telemedicine to drones to you name it. It's an exciting, sort of an exciting time because we really haven't had a big muscle mover like this in a long time.
All right, lots to think about. We've got some more ground to cover, but first we're going to take a short break. My guest today is Gwen Cadu. She is Enterprise IT and Managed Services Director at GDIT. I'm Tom Temin. This is Federal Insights, part of the Digital Modernization series discussing enterprise modernization, sponsored by GDIT here on Federal News Network.